I'm joined now by Anthony Koch, a principal at AK Strategies, for more on the assault. Anthony, thanks a lot for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
So we know that attacks on the Jewish community have increased significantly during Israel's war with Hamas, but has the government, whether local, provincial, federal, done enough to really put a stop to all of this?
Well, that's a great question. And I think in Montreal, we have a sort of front row seat to what's been going on. In this particular incident, there was a gentleman, like you said, right before Shabbat in Outremont, which is a very large Hasidic Jewish community, going for a walk with his three kids. And some guy, now we know to be a 24-year-old unnamed male as of yet, comes up, dumps his water in his face, gives him quite the pummeling, and then takes his kippah and throws it in the water fountain nearby. Now, the worst part about this is that when police was actually contacted, it took the SPVM about 40 minutes or so, just under an hour before they actually responded. And they said, oh, well, the perpetrator had already fled, so there wasn't much we could really do at the time. Now, fortunately, there was a woman who got that video that you just showed a little footage from before we started talking. And as a result of that, they were able to get an identification and actually arrest the gentleman in question. But still, a lot of people in the community are feeling a little bit dejected right now and wondering why something that maybe a few short years ago would have been national news right away sort of puttered out and now is having a little bit more of a reinvigoration in terms of media coverage. But it just sort of seems like these sorts of incidents are being treated as far too normal.
So, Anthony, what's your view on how politicians have reacted to this incident?
I mean, you got sort of the full spectrum. It was very interesting, though. Whenever you have one of these incidents that happens to another group, right, there's a full-throated denunciation from the government, in particular from the Liberal Party of Canada. And then you had, for example, Anita Anand, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs currently, who said this, quote tweeted the Prime Minister's statement, this, with a little arrow pointing down. If you look at the actual list of statements that are put out by the Liberal government officials, anti-Semitism isn't referenced once. Okay, so I just find it interesting that it does seem to be that in terms of bigotry and problems, every other group is put into one category, and the Jews are sort of put in this weird category of their own, where things are sort of dealt with a little bit with kids' gloves. It hasn't been universal across. I mean, if you take, for example, Quebec Premier François Legault has been actually pretty strong on this and very vocal about denouncing some of the activities that's been going on. But at the end of the day, I think the city of Montreal has been really bad on this. Same thing at Toronto City Hall. Everybody, I believe in free speech. Not everybody has to share my position or view on Israel. But it's been 2 years where you've got people walking in the streets praising terrorists, waving Hamas flags, waving Hezbollah flags. And I think not enough people have treated the current moment with the seriousness that I believe it requires.
So you really feel that there's kind of a double standard in terms of how politicians are responding to other instances of violence, especially against, the Jewish community?
100%. And again, it's funny, and most people don't even know this, right? But at the end of the day, if you actually look at which group is targeted by the most number of hate crimes in Canada, it's the Jewish community, and it's not even close. And that's a shocking stat to most people because you figure it'd be any number of the other groups because they get a lot more airtime. And I guess, unfortunately, the anti-Semitism is not a sexy political cause, if you will. But yeah, that's sort of the reality of the situation across large swaths of the country is that nobody really wants to hear about it. And I understand Jewish community is very vocal, and especially when you have a lot of incidents in a short amount of time, I guess some people do start to tune it out. But I think there's something a little bit deeper here that's sort of rising to the surface that's concerning for a lot of folks. And I just want to say, at the end of the day, we could all have our positions on a conflict that's going on in a foreign country. And we don't expect everybody to have the same position on that. But when we're talking about Canadian Jews living in Canada that are Canadian citizens that are living, among us, like myself included, that's a completely separate issue that should be treated very seriously.
And part of the reason for the increase in violence against Jews here in Canada has been in response to Israel's war against Hamas. But why do you think it is that some can't really differentiate between Jewish Canadians and the actions of the State of Israel or the IDF?
I think it's been a convenience. I think a lot of people had any number of nefarious ideas or anti-Semitic beliefs before, and I think the war between Israel and Hamas has allowed a lot of people, or granted people, the sort of respectability cover, if you will, for them to express their views that they held anyway. But now, instead of it being widely criticized and sort of taboo, there's been a permissibility culture that's been allowed to permeate where people are allowed to express their views much more. So I'm not so sure that this is anything new per se. I think it's just the social taboo around anti-Semitism has been massively broken, and people are using the war as a sort of convenient way to get around accusations of anti-Semitism.
So, Anthony, there are some obvious gaps in terms of how we're really handling hate crimes as a country here in Canada. But do you feel that we need new laws to maybe deal with this, or do we simply need to maybe enforce the existing laws?
Correct. So that's the thing. And I laugh. Like there was even, I think CJAR, one of the Jewish organizations, was talking about bubble legislation, which I don't support in general. And I think the big issue here, you hit the nail on the head in your question, is we don't actually need new laws. We don't need to make things that are already illegal extra, extra, super duper illegal. We just need the police officers to enforce law as it already is written on the books. Okay. So there's a question about as to why that's not been the case. But no, I don't actually think this requires legislation. It just requires police departments across the country and sort of a political will to enforce the law as it's already written.
Let me ask you your thoughts on a lot of the Palestinian, or I guess the anti-Semitic protests by a lot of Palestinian and Hamas supporters, especially in Montreal and Toronto that you're seeing right now. How does that make you feel as a Jew?
Listen, man, I'm still going to pray 3 times a day. I'm going to still wrap tefillin and put on my tallit every morning. I live a Jewish life, and it doesn't cause me any particular undue cause for harm. I think the more frustrating part, though, is how few people truly accept what you just described, in the sense that, listen, man, like I said, number of times I feel like I'm a broken record to some extent, but everybody's entitled to their opinion on a foreign conflict. Okay, if you're frustrated with some of the things the Israeli government's doing, that's fine. I don't have any idea what that has to do with supporting Yahya Sinwar or Hassan Nasrallah, Hamas, Hezbollah, all these sorts of different groups. And just last week, for example, at various points, you've seen these protesters have openly called for the destruction of Canada. Forget the state of Israel. We're talking about Canada now. Or even last week in the United States, there was a student club on group at Temple University called Students for Justice and Peace in Palestine at Temple University. And they said quite clearly, it is not only our objective to destroy the state of Israel, it is also our mission to destroy the United States of America. So these people are very proud to express the things that they believe. It's not limited to Jews. It's not limited to the state of Israel. And it's not a secret. Like, you see this, they're very open, proud, and to brandish these sorts of ideas. And I just find it a little bit disappointing that there's many people in political punditry or the media who don't feel the need to highlight those elements of protests.
So let's actually compare anti-Semitism, Anthony, prior to October 7th and post October the 7th. When 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered and many of them were taken captive as well by Hamas. Let's talk about a bit of the difference there. Obviously, we had anti-Semitism before, but how much more, in your experience, has it really increased, especially in the Montreal region?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the stats on hand, but I know there's plenty of organizations, and even the Montreal police and Toronto police have released information on this that show that there's been a massive exponential surge in anti-Semitic crimes since October 7th, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody who's been paying attention. But I think it's actually kind of perverse. The more widespread it's become, it's rather than people waking up and going, wow, I can't believe all these things are sort of happening. And that has happened in certain circles. And thank you to everybody, especially in particular non-Jews, who have been so supportive of the community in this time. I think it's had a more nefarious effect on other parts of the community, where folks just sort of have accepted this as a sort of new normal. And whereas something that would have seemed massively out of place before, now it's just sort of par for the course and part of everyday life in urban Canada. So in terms of how I experience it, I mean, I think my story is not particularly unique. I grew up in Montreal, and in my age group, I had friends of all sorts of diverse backgrounds, and I still do. But since October 7th, I've had a number of people, and I'm not, obviously I'm very vocal and political, so I guess they have more cover to some respect. But I'm saying regular Jews were just completely socially ostracized and cut off by all sorts of people because of their refusal to denounce the Jewish state, or whatever you want to call it. And you're seeing that already across the world. You have incidences in Sydney where you have doctors talking about, I know there's medical professionals that were suspended, I believe, for 2 years without pay for saying that they would kill any Israeli that found their way into their hospital, or all sorts of stuff like that that's been normalized. So, like, again, I think to go back similarly to an answer that I gave earlier on, I think what we're seeing is a lot of these sort of evil, nasty perspectives on Jews that were always sort of there have just been allowed to be unleashed since October 7th because of the cover that the war has provided people. And it's been shocking to some, less shocking to others. I think it's just sad.
Anthony Koch, principal with AK Strategies, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.